There's a thing that follows trucks across the four corners. It isn't a skinwalker in the way stories frame them, and the locals I talk to don't like to pin a name on it, but for lack of anything better, some of us started calling it Fleshgait. That's my word for it. The people who live out there call it by other words or by silence. Take that as you will. I haul cattle out of the high desert. Independent driver, my own rig, my own problems. I'm not a storyteller. I'm a guy who counts animals, checks brakes, and keeps a weather eye on radios that never quite pick up a signal where I work. The route I had that winter paid better than most. Steady loads from Navajo country to markets in the valley, then back with empty trailer miles that let you think too much. It's long stretches of nothing. Mesa on one side, arroyo on the other. A night that rolls in like a flat blanket. Cell bars drop to zero by the time you hit Chinle and stay there until you hit the interstate 10 hours later. There's a rhythm to hauling cattle that makes you practical by necessity. Check the latches, walk the trailer. Count the steers again because you did it 3 hours ago and it keeps you sane. Heat up your dinner in a microwave that has seen better years. Keep the rig ventilated. The smell of cattle in the cab is a living thing. Sleep in shifts. Keep the window cracked and the CB key within reach. Drive when you need to. Stop only in places that have other rigs or lights. That last rule is the one I broke. After the first run, after the money hit the account and the truck smelled like hay and diesel in the desert at dawn, I told myself the rest would be easy. The cowboys I worked with call me practical. Miguel, one of the ranch hands, calls me stubborn. Dorothy, who runs the truck stop and knows everything that moves across the reservation, just looked at me steady and said, "Don't stop for it." Not in a warning that's all show. It was flat and without theatrics, like she was telling me the tire pressure. She'd poured coffee into a styrofoam cup, handed it over, and when I asked about the drag marks out by the pens, she slid into a long silence and then said, matter of fact, "You don't stop for that. Not for that voice, not for what looks like somebody you know. You keep driving." Dorothy wouldn't say much else. She's lived on that stretch for longer than I've been alive. She talks slow, and the way she looks at you makes you reckon with how small your place is on a map. She didn't use any sacred terms I could repeat, and I didn't press. I learned quick to take the warning as local practice rather than a universal truth. Respect, not explanation. People who know that land owed me no lectures. They gave me the kind of counsel that makes sense inside the lines of their life. The first weird thing I noticed myself was small and quiet. I woke once in the cab because the rig had settled oddly, trailer shifting its weight on a county road at 2 in the morning. When I stepped out to pull the straps and check the animals, there was a drag mark in the hard pan right where my bumper had been when I last parked. It was long, the kind of smear you'd expect from something heavy dragged along the ground. 4 feet of rough, dried earth abrasion, and then a narrower trail that vanished into the shrubs. I circled the truck and found the drag mark at my driver door, close enough that whatever made it could have been as large as a person or something smaller pulling its weight. The soil had a weird smell to it, rotten sweet like a fruit left to rot in a closed cooler. It was one of those smells that sits behind your teeth. You can't sniff it away. "I told Miguel because you tell the guys who load the cattle." He didn't laugh or say it was coyotes or a prank. He stood on the tailgate and watched the horizon like he was listening. "Don't let your lights go out here," he said. "Not long." His voice had the same set edges as Dorothy's, the kind that means experience and a ledger of bad nights. Nighthawk was a CB handle I learned to trust. The man on the other end had an old voice that cut through deadband, like he knew every canyon between here and Shiprock. He'd been on the air long enough to pass along gossip and practical tips, potholes, cattle drift, cops who liked to sit by the way station and drink bad coffee. Once, on a quiet midnight run, Nighthawk came over the channel with a clipped tone and said, "Watch the soft shoulders past mile 60. Don't stop if something looks like you." No joke, no story, just that flat line, the kind of instruction that makes you think of some unnamed hazard and then makes you not test it. For a while I chalked the drag mark up to stray animals, or a drunk who crossed a field. You start with the small, rational things because your job punishes superstition. You're on the road to make money, to keep the account steady, to keep the family fed. Fear is a luxury, or so I thought, until the cattle started doing things that didn't look like fear I'd seen before. Cattle have their own language. They hum to each other when the wind is on them right. They sway in a slow chatter that drivers learn to read. One night the whole load went silent. Not restless, not mooing, just a hush that felt wrong. They pressed to the far side of the trailer, not against the gate but away from something outside. The engine idled and the heater breathed, but there was a sound from outside that made them do a thing I'd never seen. One by one, they lifted their heads and made this long, drawn-out noise that didn't fit moo. It was thick, like a throat closing and trying to sing, and then all at once they sounded it together, a high, knotty scream that made me drop the coffee cup I'd been holding. I shut the doors and checked my phone, no bars, but the CB picked up a half-come-in from someone 2 trucks down. A voice I didn't recognize said, "You hear that? They're not right tonight." No more, no story. Just a confirmation from somewhere out in the dark that they were seeing the same thing I was. The next day, Miguel brought over a steer that had a scrape down one flank, along the ribs. It looked like something had grazed it with claws, but didn't cut deep. The hide was raw and the hair stuck up in the direction of the mark, as if something had brushed by the animal with more weight than fur. The rancher shrugged. "Coyotes do that sometimes," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. His hands worked the rope like his mind was on other things. There's a point where the list of odd things starts to stack up, and the apron of rational explanations wears thin. You tally it. Drag mark, humming cattle, an animal with an unexplained scrape, Nighthawk telling you not to stop, Dorothy giving you that look. If you're like me, you sit with those bits and try to thread them into a sensible pattern. If you're like Miguel and the old-timers, you don't play with patterns you weren't born into. I saw something on the shoulder of a county road that wasn't an animal, and it didn't move right. I was moving past at 25, and it was a patch of pale against the scrub, a figure that sat too still to be wind-blown brush. At first, I thought a person, skinny, wrapped in something that glinted like wet skin. Then it shifted in a way that made my mouth dry. Its joints didn't line up with the idea of a human. The shoulder of its hip rolled like a hinge that belonged more to a machine than a body. It glanced at the road where my headlights passed and didn't blink like a human would. It just turned its pale face like a loose mask. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My hands had a memory of Dorothy's voice in them. Keep going. But even the memory of moving away didn't steady me. Something about the way it looked at the road made me think it was measuring me, not watching, taking stock. That was the first time I thought, maybe this is something that keeps to the road like we do, something that follows trucks, because that's where it finds the world. There are people who will tell you that when you start seeing odd things out there, it's your mind going soft from the miles, and I'll admit to that possibility. But 2 nights after the roadside glimpse, the cattle screamed again, and this time there were prints out by the water troughs that made no animal sense. They were long, not like bear or coyote prints, which meant whoever or whatever left them had a stride too big for a human. The impressions pressed the soil in a staggered pattern, half moon at the front, an elongated smudge behind, like a hand had been dragged and then planted. We measured it out of habit, the ranch hands and me, because you measure things to make them smaller. The prints formed a slow circle around the pens. They were outside the fence, close enough that if the fence had been lower, you could have reached through and touched the heel mark and felt it. The prints never crossed the threshold. They edged, and then stopped, and then someone had dragged whatever it was along the hardpan toward the arroyo. It read like a loop in an animal's thinking, cautious but purposeful. The smell followed too. That rotten sweet scent pooled in low places, settling like oil on the air. I can tell you it made you want to wash your hands and throw out your jacket. Miguel said it reminded him of something his grandfather talked about, old stories about things that fed on livestock and left a smell like drying fruit. He spoke slowly around the word old, as if the word itself were a warning. I started changing patterns. I parked under lights where I could. I tried to time my stops for truck plazas where there were at least 6 rigs. I kept the tack room locked and the CB on even when I wasn't driving, because there's a comfort in white noise. I told the dispatcher I preferred morning loads, and they laughed and said, "You're not the first to ask." And that comforted me for an evening. But the comfort is thin when the land around you is so big it has a hunger of its own. There was a diner man who ate the same late shift as me at a grease-spattered table near the kitchen door. He was an older driver who'd long since given up the road and kept the coffee warm for the young ones. Once, between fried eggs, He told me he'd followed something along US 160 for a month before he quit his route and took a station job. He pressed his palms on the formica and said the words like a confession. Follows you for a month. Sound like your own voice sometimes. Doesn't stop until you can't sleep anymore. It sounded like a story then, one of those motel tales that keeps you from leaving with a full stomach. But there was a tremor in his voice I didn't expect. It don't hurt you in ways you can show the doctor, he said. It takes the things you can't show, your peace, your sleep, your way of living comfortable. The CB is where rumor becomes reality for drivers. Voices drift across channels with slang and distances attached like parcels. Someone out there can be miles away and in your ear with a detail you needed to know. That's where I heard something that stopped being rumor for me. It was late. I'd pulled off to a turnout and left the engine idling. The trailer rattled with the hum of cattle. The desert was blunt and quiet. I was telling myself to get some sleep when the CB sparked with a voice that made my hands cold. It copied me. Not satirically exactly, less like a mimic and more like an echo that snatched words out of the air. I had been talking to myself, I think, because sometimes that's what you do when you're alone. I said something about wanting to be home for Christmas, and the reply came back over the channel, garbled and off by a breath, my own words twisted. Want to be home. Want. Home for... I dropped the mic, and the hiss from the channel seemed to settle like dust. When I picked it back up, there was nothing but static and someone saying Roger, half a mile down in the talk. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a common technical hiccup. The sound was a shiver that wore on the teeth of the road. After that, sleep got expensive. You can't measure how tired you are until something starts twisting your ordinary certainties. I started waking for no reason. I double-checked the doors at night. I drove with the interior lights on sometimes, which embarrassed me like a child making a tent out of a blanket. My hands found their way to the gun I'd kept in the glove compartment more than once, half out of habit and half out of a response that felt nearly useless. The pattern's obviousness made its own gravity. Drag marks, strangers with a steady gaze at the side of the road, cattle that refused to be near certain paddocks, prints that circled fence posts, voices that returned your words with a twist. And always, when I asked about a name, people deferentially changed the subject or said the same thing Dorothy had. Don't stop for it. They wouldn't give me a proper word for the thing. Some elders said nothing at all. Others used a phrase I couldn't repeat, because it was wrapped up in belief and language I had no right to extract like a souvenir. So I clung to practical things. I tried different routes, timed my drives to avoid dark stretches, avoided lonely rest stops, and always kept the rig in motion when I could. The thought of quitting came and sat heavy with me. The money was good enough to make a man keep his mouth shut. You don't get paid for courage out here. You get paid for keeping the line moving. Still, the idea of walking away from the contract crossed my mind more times than I'd expected. Then there was the night the radio came alive with my own voice again, but closer, and this time it was broken up into syllables that matched my breath. I'd pulled in late to a yard that had lights on half their poles. It was one of those small places where the men gather around and trade coffee and lean on hoods. I parked and nabbed a nap, or tried to. Sometime in the heavy quiet, I woke to a soft, dry sound, like fingernails on aluminum. At first I thought it was the cattle shifting. Then it was in the air and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. Over the channel just a whisper came, "You safe." The voice cut like wind through a loose window pane. It was shaped like my voice, my cadence, my pitch, wronged and slipping over itself. I picked up the mic before I thought. "Who's calling?" I asked. The voice repeated. "Who? Calling? Who's calling?" Like someone had pressed my words into a blender. I slapped off the CB and sat with my hand on the wheel for a long time. Light buzzed from the lot lamps. Trucks slept like animals under their covers. I tried to tell myself it was another driver messing around, but it didn't sound like a man laughing. It sounded like a thing searching for permission. That night I didn't sleep well. I watched the lot at the edge of sleep and thought I saw movement in the curve of the road. The kind of movement you tell yourself is hooded and shrouded, and therefore not worth trouble. That shadow the mind gives you when it's tired. In the morning there was a smear near the trailer, like someone had dragged something along the gravel and left a trail of faint ichor that dried in the sun. The smear was half the width of my hand and no wider than a finger's breadth deep. It didn't look like blood. It smelled that same rotten sweet thing again, faint now in the heat, but there. There were no prints close to it, like whatever made it couldn't stand upright by the trailer. I told my dispatcher I was going to take a long layover, that I needed to sort some paperwork and check the rig. He said, "You good?" And I lied. You learn to lie like that on the road. It keeps folks from worrying and keeps you from being yanked into something you can't explain. But in the dry of the afternoon, with the rig weighed and the cows quiet, the thought of staying another night put a physical pressure on my chest. You're supposed to be pragmatic. You're supposed to be unflappable. I was neither. Word travels fast in the desert. That evening, Nighthawk keyed the channel and said slow and low, "If it talks like you, don't answer." He didn't say anything else, and that felt like a mercy. On the way out the next day, as the mesa burned with a low sun, I saw a trucker on the shoulder who looked shell-shocked. He was younger and shaking his head like he'd been up too long. I parked and went to him. He said he'd been followed for weeks, radio noises when he slept, a feeling of being watched, tracks that circled his compound. He'd cut his insurance and sold half his cattle to get off the route. He said money could be replaced. Sleep and the sense of being your own person could not. I left my rig running most nights, he told me. If it comes, it wants you still. If it don't catch you awake, it takes pieces of the life you had. It don't need to make a mess to win. It's hard to parse the language of scare into the ledger of living. Some things you can budget for, maintenance, fuel, and time. Other things are more like weather. You can't control them, and if you ignore them long enough, they rearrange the work into a list of what not to do's. I kept going. You can't leave a contract lightly in this business without consequences. I learned to check the truck before I closed my eyes and to look for drag marks when I walked the lane in the morning. I started sleeping with the CB on, even when there was only static. My routines multiplied around the landscape of caution, little rituals to keep the world sensible. Lock the gate, run the trailer fans, check the water pans. Leave the cab light on when you sleep. They aren't guarantees. They're the equivalent of a flashlight held at arm's length against a room of possibilities. There were more looks, more signs. An animal at the fence that stared at me like it recognized the wrong kind of presence. A rancher who refused to let cattle out after dusk. A dog that would bark until it seemed the sound ran out of its throat. Sometimes the signs were small enough to be explained away. Sometimes they weren't. The more they stacked up, the more the idea of a single explanation, coyotes, weather, pranks, seemed like a coat someone tossed over an empty chair. It fit, but it didn't warm. Once, parked under a low-hanging moon, I felt like someone was circling the truck. The cattle hummed like a massage machine. I lay half awake, trying to count breaths, when I heard the sound of sandals or talons on patchy gravel. It started far and moved closer in a manner that made no animal sense, stomping where a bird should hop. I watched the light wash the cab and saw the shadow against the aluminum, elongated, bending in ways a body shouldn't bend. I forced myself not to peek, because curiosity felt like a hook. That night I didn't open the door until the sun pushed up and made promises none of them kept. When I stepped out, there were prints. Circle marks around the tires, not deep but present, like someone had come close enough to the rig to look in and then stepped along the side and away. The smell lingered in the morning like a stubborn dye. I took a picture because my hands were shaking, and pictures make the mind believe what it sees. The phone camera didn't show much, just light and dust, but the image made my stomach drop in a way words don't reach. I started keeping company with the thought that maybe this creature, the name is a placeholder, I know that, didn't want animals or cargo as much as it wanted the way we move. Maybe it liked the cadence of engines, the rhythm of rigs, the small frailties of drivers who slept in their cabs. Maybe it copied voices because voices are a way into a mind. Maybe I'm being poetic. Maybe I'm inventing cause where there is none. I tell you this not as an affidavit, but as a ledger of how it felt. The more you try to be rational about an irrational pattern, the more you find yourself making small compacts with fate. I avoided lone rest stops. I parked under light. I never, not once after Dorothy's look, pulled over for a figure that looked like a person on the shoulder. I started talking to myself on long hauls because it made my voice familiar in a benign way. I kept a pistol where I could reach it, not because I thought it would help in a physical brawl, but because it's an anchor. Tools make you feel like a person instead of prey. There's an economy of rumor that exists across the rigs. Drivers trade stories like weather reports. Someone mentioned a man who quit his route and sold his truck rather than keep it. Another said they parked at dawn and found their load lighter by one animal, but with no physical trace, no body, no blood, nothing to read. Those are the stories that make the rounds when the heaters are on and coffee runs slow. You never hear them from folks who say they've seen it and stayed. You hear them from the people who left. Once I picked up a load where the rancher refused to let me park by the usual shed. "Not tonight," he said, and when I asked, he shrugged and said, "Don't like light around that yard. People are practical out there, they adapt. They trade superstitions the way they trade pens. Maybe it has rules. Maybe those rules are born from experience, and maybe they're born of fear. I don't know which." As spring thinned into the long dry of summer, the signs became less patient. I started catching glimpses in the periphery. A pale thing at the edge of a wash that didn't look swollen like any animal I knew. A face that turned toward me with a smile that had nothing good in it. A smile like a cracked mask. I'd look away because looking felt like consent. The dogma of the road is, don't be curious in places where curiosity costs you your life in ways no mortician can tally. I wasn't the only one feeling watched. The lot where I slept 1 month had a new driver who'd gone to the state line and quit, said it had followed him that far. Another driver told me that once something copied his wife's voice over the line and called his name, and he left his rig right after and walked away from everything because the voice in his ear was his wife telling him to come closer. People quit routes sometimes for reasons that make financial sense, and other times for reasons that make emotional sense. When your wife calls and tells you to come back into the dark, something has broken you loose from the ledger of work. I tried to keep records. Times, places, the smell, measurements of drag marks. It's comforting to collect evidence. It's also delusional in a way that keeps you occupied. The more I logged, the more the pattern teased a mind tired of hauling. Drag marks ranged from 3 to 6 feet. Smells averaged the same rotten sweet tone, coming on like an animal's aftertaste. Footprints ranged long, and the stride suggested something taller than me, or something that could lengthen itself when it moved. People started giving me names in the way people do, names so we can make monsters manageable. Fleshgait caught on because it sounded like an old engine knocking. It sounded like a place where skin meets step. But I always prefaced it with a caveat. Locals don't call it that, and some won't talk at all. Dorothy said the land has its own ways, and some things the land keeps to itself. She refused to make it a spectacle. That felt important to me. Respect, not appropriation. That was how I treated what I'd seen. Not as a story to tell around campfires, but as a hazard to be acknowledged and avoided when possible. Then, one evening as the sun hollowed and the wind came up, I hit a stretch of road where the horizon turned yellow and the air looked like flour dust. The radio hissed and there was a flavor of static that felt wrong. The cattle were quiet in the trailer. The rig felt heavier, like the air pressed down on it. I remember thinking stupidly that dust storms were a thing you could predict. They're not. The sky folded and turned to a dull color that didn't feel like weather, and you could taste grit in your teeth. I kept driving because moving felt safer than stopping. I told myself that movement is money. I told myself everything a man on the highway tells himself to keep the world sensible. The wind became a voice. It pushed like a tide. The headlights smeared, and the lanes become a suggestion. A pickup in front of me slowed to a crawl and then pulled to the shoulder. We shared a look through our mirrors, 2 hunched silhouettes in the dark, and then he pulled out and was swallowed by the storm. When the cab filled with dust and my gauges bounced like nervous birds, I found myself wondering whether all the things I'd collected and feared could be written away as an accident of timing. Maybe this was just poor weather. Maybe that's what I told myself as the road disappeared. I tightened my grip and prayed to a God I don't often speak to, a small plea for safe passage, because the city had rules and the desert had none. I was still in that thinking when the CB crackled with a sound that made the hair on my neck lift. Static, and then my own voice. thin and blurred, carrying a phrase I'd said half an hour before the storm. "Keep your lights on," it said in my tone, a small, intimate echo that felt like someone at my shoulder. The radio died, and the sound of the wind took over and made everything into an animal. I kept driving until the truck shuddered. The engine dropped like it had gone under a heavy hand. The dash light blinked and then went dark. Tires complained. The world beyond the cab was a smear of brown. I coasted to a slow stop in a wash of grit, and when the engine died, the silence had edges. When I climbed out to check the cab, the desert lay around me like a throat. I saw tracks where there had been none, long half-moon prints that hesitated at the trailer and then walked off in a line that curved away. I didn't look to my left or right. Dorothy's face came back to me, the way she had looked through coffee steam and told me, "Don't stop for it." I stayed with the truck that night because I could not see myself risking the dark. I kept the CB on low. My hands were steady, but only because I had no other use for them. The wind pressed like a living thing. Something passed around the trailer in a slow, careful way, testing the range of the lights, feeling the edges of steel and rubber. I felt watched in ways I had learned to name and in ways I hadn't. I didn't see the thing then. I heard it move. There was a sound like fingernails on corrugated metal, and then what I can only call a smile in the dark, a feeling that someone had been close enough to see my face and had chosen to find amusement in it. It did not make a sound like a human laugh. It was a sense that something found the smallness of a man in his cab entertaining. In the morning I found a drag mark along the passenger side, fresh and glistening in a way the sun couldn't quite clean. It led into the sage and disappeared. There were prints that circled the tires and stopped where the engine cooled. The smell hung low and clung to the seats when I opened the door. I drove out of that place with my heart in my throat and my hands on the wheel. The radio stayed quiet until I crossed into town. Men in the yard looked at me like I'd been in a storm. Nighthawk keyed his channel and said, "You get out?" I lied and said, "Yeah, because there are truths you say loud and ones you keep like a coin in your pocket." I moved on, but the ledger of oddities wasn't something you could pay off. It sat in the back of your mind like a stubborn debt. I kept my routines, my lighted parking spots, my waking with the grace of the paranoid. I kept my glove compartment pistol for reassurance more than anything else. When you work on the road, you learn to trade uncertainties and cobble together safety from common sense and superstition in equal measure. And yet, even with all those precautions, I began to notice things following me beyond that stretch. Small, shadow things at rest stops, the smell when I pulled into city lots, a glance that felt like recognition. Once I thought I saw it in the reflection of a diner window as I passed a parking lot, a pale thing that tilted its head like a dog watching you move. It stepped away when I looked full on, but it was never far. People ask why men like me keep driving after nights like that. The answer is complicated. Money, pride, habits, a stubbornness built into the bones of men who won't ask for help. But there's something else darker and quieter. The knowledge that the road is part of you by the time you're done, and leaving it leaves a hole you don't know how to fill. I wasn't ready to give it up. I thought I could outdrive the thing. That's arrogance, plain and simple. On a late run that month, the CB picked up a voice that sounded like a man who'd been throat-cut by the road. He said flat, "If it learns you, it keeps you. If it copies, you answer once and it knows the cadence." There was a swallow of static. Don't answer. It was practical. It was cold. It was a man who had either been taught or had learned the hard way. I kept the radio as a talisman. I kept the lights on. I kept the truck moving. And still the world of small signs assembled itself into a pattern that would soon break loose into something else, something that didn't care if you'd learned the rules. I don't tell you this to frighten you for the sake of it. I tell you because there are people who glide across those miles thinking they own them. And there are people who have been startled awake by the knowledge that the land has other tenants. If you're driving out there, if you cross reservation lines into places where cell towers don't bother, take the local warnings serious. Respect the elders who talk about these things in halting phrases. They'll tell you what to do, and they'll also refuse to say the name out loud. The road will teach you things in time. For me, it taught the price of looking twice. It taught that a voice can be a weapon. It taught that the land keeps secrets, and sometimes returns them in the form of a smile in the dark. That night in the wash, with the engine dead and the desert pressing close, I made a choice that felt like survival and like cowardice. I started the rig back up and drove with the headlights pinned forward, faster than I should have, the tires throwing grit and the radio dead aside from the soft hiss of static. Behind me, I thought, I heard something move, like a long thing folding itself into the track of my tires. I didn't look in the mirrors. I drove until the lights of the next town promised pavement and people and the kind of ordinary hum that makes a life feel like a life again. I parked under a bank of sodium bulbs and sat with the engine running until the sun pushed the night out by inches. The cattle were quiet, but the memory of the close smile sat in my chest like a stone. In the weeks after, the thing didn't stop following. I started seeing evidence in places I should have felt safe, a smear on the back step of a rest stop, the rotten sweet smell in the vestibule of a diner, footprints in the gravel of a truck stop. I thought I had escaped that night in the wash. I was wrong. You don't escape anything that's learned the sound of your breath. I won't say I'm a hero. I won't say I stood and fought in the dark. I did what a man does when he's tired and scared. I kept moving. I made practical compromises. I listened to people who had been there before me, but the fact that it followed me beyond the reservation lines meant I'd become interesting to it in a way that made me feel small. There's a story that gets told at truck stops about a man who left his rig and never came back. Some men tell it with an edge in their voice like a warning, and some tell it matter-of-fact, like an inevitability. I heard that version, and I didn't laugh. My life is tied to a steering wheel and a ledger. The idea of being forced off the road in that way is a kind of death you can't buy an obituary for. When the nights kept stacking and the signs kept arriving, I started to change my habits in ways that embarrassed me. I stopped answering CB calls that sounded like my wife or like my own voice. I started sleeping in motels when I could, washing the smell out of my jacket and the dust out of my hair. I found myself avoiding Navajo land at night more strictly than a route would prefer, which earned me no small amount of side-eye from dispatch. I lied and said it was logistics. I didn't say it was the thing that had started learning me. There are still nights when I wake in a sweat and reach for the radio because the silence out there tastes like a threat. The pattern hasn't stopped, and I don't know if it will. I do know that the more I try to explain it in a ledger, the more it slips into stories people choose to believe. I tell you this because the road is a democratically dangerous place. Anyone can be chosen. And because the rules the locals gave me are practical. Don't stop. Don't answer familiar voices. Don't look for names where elders refuse to give them. If you're new to this channel or these tales, subscribe if you want more road stories like this. If you can stand them. Keep the lights on when you park out there. Heed the people who have lived on the land longer than you. They'll tell you the same thing Dorothy told me with that flat, hard look. Don't stop for it. I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this because what I learned out there didn't stay in a single night or on a single county road. It threaded into the rest of my life in small, disagreeable ways. The smell on my jacket weeks later, the blanking out of a memory on an empty stretch of highway, the way I jumped at my own name when someone called from the next room. If you spend enough time on those miles, you either find a way to live with whatever the land keeps to itself, or you leave it behind. I tried both. The night that finally changed everything for me wasn't the first time my engine died in the dust, but it was the only time I saw what was making those drag marks and leaving its prints in the soft places. I had taken a run later than I planned, bad timing and a good load, and the horizon was already under the color of coming weather when the radio broke into pieces. The wind had that flour-sour quality that tells you there's grit in the air, and with it a kind of silence that feels like a tension. You can hear the desert holding its breath when a storm like that comes. I remember pulling to the shoulder to slow down because the brownout made the road a strip of thick paint. Headlights were 4 white coins in the blur. The truck ahead of me came to a stop, and I watched his taillights die like a pair of eyes closing. For a stupid second, one of those seconds that folds up in your memory, I thought about pulling across to a small turn just past the wash where a few rigs usually huddle, but the lot was empty. I parked, more because the truck felt wrong under the gusts than because of any plan. The engine gave the little cough it gives when it wants fuel, and then went entirely flat. Dash lights winked and died. the cab filled with the background hiss of the heater trying to catch itself. I tried the key. The starter spun, and nothing caught. I had my phone but no bars, and by then the wind had a voice. The cattle in the trailer were pinned quiet, heads low. They should have been restless, maddened even by the pressure of the wind, but they were unnaturally still, like men will be in a courtroom when the verdict reads in favor of another life. I stepped out because habit forces you to walk where your hands have to work. The air hit my face and filled my mouth with grit. I could taste metal and something sweeter beneath it, like citrus gone wrong. There were prints around the tires, long, half-mooned as before, but this time they were closer. They made a not-quite circle, a careful spiral toward where I stood. They stopped just short of the cab, then kept along the side of the trailer and into the sage. Close enough, I thought, for something to look in the window. I climbed into the cab because I wanted the engine to be warm if I had to make a getaway. I turned the CB on out of habit, and because there's a comfort in human voices, even if the only human voices out there are separated by miles. Static at first, then low and grammatically wrong, the channel bent the edge of my words back to me. "Keep lights on," it said. Not an echo, not an imitation so much as a picking apart of the sound, a putting back together wrong. The words were my words, the same way a mirror gives you an image that's not quite yours. I felt that old and strange nausea, like being unmoored. I slapped the mic down and the radio died back to static, like someone had turned their hand away. There was movement outside that made no animal noise. The sound was a scrabble, like someone trying on different ways to walk. It moved slow at first, and then with an economy of motion that made me think of predation rather than curiosity. Wherever it touched, the ground left a smear of that rotten sweet smell. I told myself if I stayed calm and waited daylight, it would be some drunk or a coyote. I sat there telling myself a lot of things that night. It came in stages. First, a shadow bowed along the nose of the trailer, two pale shoulders sliding past my lamps like clotted wax. The shape was too tall and too long-limbed for a man standing upright. Its skin, if skin is the right word, caught and reflected the meager light in a wet sheen, as if it had been dipped in the wash of the storm. It had joints that bent wrong, an arm folding where an arm shouldn't fold, and then a face that wasn't a human face, but tried to use human facades. The eyes were not eyes the way I know them. They were pits that drank the light. The mouth split in an imitation of a smile. The first thing that hit me was the smile. It's ridiculous how small an expression can contain such intent. It was wide, too wide. The lips pulled back over teeth that seemed too many and too small, like teeth from a child's doll. The smile did not curve toward warmth. It was a measurement. It catalogued me with an arithmetic cruelty I can't put into a better word. I stayed in the cab because movement felt like acceptance, and acceptance can be a contract. I kept my hands where I could reach the gun, but I also knew the gun was theater more than anything else. A bullet might have made noise. Noise could have been a signal in the dark, or it could have been a cue. There are things you learn to say aloud in the world of hauling. Don't be the one to make a last show. Move and get stories for later. But that night, movement meant stepping into the margin of what I did not understand. It sniffed. I heard a wet sound just outside the door, the kind of noise a creature makes when it evaluates the temperature of a thing. Then it did something that I will carry as long as I live. It bent down and dropped to all fours like a person, folding themselves into a dog or a thing that had learned to imitate a dog. There's a sound when a body takes a new center of gravity, bones and skin reshuffling into a way of moving that is wrong and effective all at once. It slid along the gravel, closer to the cab, head tilted as if listening to the small vibrations of my breath. I unhooked the pistol because habit wants you to have an answer. I thought, fire a shot, make a noise, scare it off. I aimed where a head might be. I didn't pull the trigger. It was an instinct that felt like cowardice and wisdom scrapping in my chest. Instead, I rolled up the window and locked the door and sat like a thing in a trap. When it reached the cab, it pressed its face to the glass, close enough that its breath fogged a small circle against the pane. I could make out the outline then. Long skull, a thin nose that might have been a nose once, a mouth that opened and closed in smiles, and small imitative noises. It made no attempt to break the glass. It simply studied me. The CB, which had been silent, came alive for a second, with a sound that matched my own breathing. Then it did something I will never forget, and that I have said to no one with the same steadiness I say it to you now. It smiled the way one might show a dog a trick, and it crawled. Not toward me in the way a person would rush a door, but away with a deliberate, controlled motion, like an animal that knew the value of distance. It slid back along the side of the trailer, keeping its head turned toward me, smiling while it slid. It was as if it wished to leave me with the exact taste of that smile. It never once made a sound that could be called a voice, not in the human sense. But then, almost as if timed with its crawl, the CB picked up my own voice in long, wrong syllables. "Don't stop for—" I thought I heard myself whispering. The words arrived as if rearranged by someone who understood pattern but not meaning. The radio fizzed into nothing. The creature stopped at the edge of the light, and then folded back into the sage like smoke. I sat and listened until the dawn scrubbed the grit from the air. When light came, the world had the honest clarity of the desert in waking, sharp rocks, the burn of sagebrush, the accurate color of what is living. The prints were all around the rig, a careful spiral, and in the soft ground some claw-like drags cut shallow arcs. There was a smear on the passenger side step, the same rotten sweet smell in the fibers of my jacket when I pulled it free. I took pictures before I knew why, and later the pictures felt like fakes. The camera captured light and dust and no smiling thing. After that night, I didn't tell many people the full truth. You learn to ration your confessions. I called my dispatcher and said the truck was playing up. He sent someone to tow me in, and we put a patch in the engine that would last until the next town. I delivered the cattle the day after and signed the papers because that's how the business runs. The job gets done, the ledger gets balanced, and you make promises you don't intend to keep. I quit the route 3 weeks later. It was an ugly kind of resignation, less heroism than exhaustion, and I owed most of it to that thing's smile and its way of moving. Money was an argument. The company tried to keep me with promises that had a clinical sort of comfort, reassignments, new routes, a vacation. In cubicles far from dust, numbers ring right until the men in shorts and office shirts forget the cost of night. I watched my options and slowly counted the cost of staying. Sleep, I decided, matters more than an extra $1,000 in the account. People will tell you I left because I was a coward, and some of them will be right. I left because there are things in this world you can fight and win, and things you cannot translate into victory. You can't bargain with a landscape. You can't threaten a pattern that has learned the sound of your breath. So I sold what I couldn't carry and kept what I could. I told the office I was taking time off while I fixed my rig. I meant it in the way a person means vague promises. For a while I thought distance would make it forget me. I took short runs on highways with rooms of sodium-lighted exits and lots of people. I washed my jacket. I slept in motel rooms with heavy drapes and triple-locked doors. When I moved in places where the towers were dense and the hills were short and polite. It helped, in a mechanical way. It didn't stop the part of me that had been recorded. Then the small signs started. A coffee shop in a town 2 states away had the rotten, sweet smell on the back step. A rest area had prints around the concrete picnic tables like the thing had visited and decided not to sit. At a truck stop, I saw a pale shape slip behind an overpass and then stop and turn as if to measure my passing. People who knew me asked if I'd gone hollow and a little crazy from mileage and worry. They had good points. Fatigue and superstition do weave together, but there are gaps in that doctrine where certain facts sit heavy. The last real encounter, if last means the kind that leaves a mark you can point to, happened on a cold night 3 autumns after I'd left the route that first taught me caution. I'd taken a local contract on a run that bisected some of the same mesas, but this time I was hauling feed, not cattle. I thought distance would change the nature of attention. I thought the thing might prefer flesh and therefore not be interested. Assumptions are how men get surprised. It was late, and I'd stopped at a way station to sign off. The lot was lit by bulbs that made everything look cheap and brass. I was tired in the way a man is tired when he hasn't slept right for a week. I unhitched the trailer and stood there stretching, the cold running like a river in my fingers. I spotted movement in the puddle near the road. something pale that had the wrong shape. I looked away because I have a habit of not engaging strange things on sight. Then it stepped into the road. At first it was only a silhouette against sodium light, then it took shape. It walked like a person who had learned to curve their limbs to make more ground. It did not run. It came to the center of the lane and stopped, and for a moment I thought it might step in front of me. I braked while my mind measured the options. It tilted its head as if at a private joke, and then, without a noise, put an arm out and stepped aside on purpose. You need to understand what that looked like. A pale, wet-bodied shape. Something with the wrong hips and the wrong knees, stopping and then moving out of my path as if to let me pass. Its face, its grin, was not a horror show flourish, but a direct communication. Not a threat so obvious as to be honest, but a careful private amusement, like someone letting you know you'd been observed and passed a test of some sort. I could have stopped. I could have leapt from my cab and tried to get a look or a shot. I didn't. My feet kept to the pedals because nerves had taught me to be practical. It looked at me and smiled the way people do when they are sure their joke will land. Then it moved aside into darkness like a man now letting a car pass. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't polite. It was something that recognized my path and decided I was worth studying, not worth immediate consumption. I passed it at maybe 15 miles an hour. When I looked in my rearview mirror, it was gone. There was no drag mark, no print, no smear. The road behind me was clean, as if a storm had just polished it. I sat at the next stop and ate a sandwich because vibrations in the stomach make you feel like a person again. Later, I told no one the full truth. I told one friend that I'd seen something out there, and he gave me a look like a callous. Some people are factory tough about freak occurrences, which helps when you work nights. That action, its stepping aside, has been the hardest part to understand. For years I thought maybe it just liked the danger of proximity, and sometimes was satisfied with the nervous energy of a man who knows he's being watched. Then I met someone named Lyle at a truck wash who'd been on a different route. He said with the kind of casual cruelty men sometimes carry, if they let you pass, it's not mercy, it's marking. He didn't elaborate and didn't have to. Marking is its own language. Maybe it learns, maybe it catalogues, maybe it's indifferent. I don't know why it chose to step away that night. I only know the shape of the thing that looked like a grin, and the way it moved out like a student stepping off a stage after giving a performance that pleased an unseen audience. After that, I found my life rearranged around that knowledge. I avoid single-lane county roads at night. I never stop for figures that look like people on the shoulder. I don't pick up voices on the CB that sound like home. Those rules have a cost. They make you a little more timid, a little less open, and if you're the sort of man who counts charm against pay, you'll find it stings. But the rules kept me from something worse, or maybe merely kept me alive long enough to tell you this. People ask sometimes if I think the thing has a motive. Some truckers I know barter in folklore and say it's a kind of old spirit risen like a memory of the land's long hunger. Others call it a skinwalker by association, and then hasten to tell me that the comparison is unfair. Some elders won't speak its name on the road. Dorothy once told me, with that flat voice she uses for facts she doesn't want to mythologize, that there are things you don't try to make into argument. They are part of the place, she said, and then clucked her tongue and changed the subject. That felt like an instruction to me. Respect, don't curate. There are practical things to do if you find yourself in territory like that. Keep moving when you can. Park under lights and near other rigs. Don't get out if you're alone and something looks like a person, especially if it looks like someone you know. If you hear a voice on the radio that imitates you or a loved one, don't answer. Keep a record if you can. Times, smells, prints. Recordings are useful only until they become points of obsession. Talk to the local people and listen. Take their warnings as practices rather than metaphysical statements. Their recommendations come from living there. Their caution is earned. I left the heavy hauling for good a while after the last full encounter. I took odd jobs near population centers. I washed and folded my life into less open spaces. The thing didn't vanish. You carry it with you in the shape of the little alerts your body gives you in sleep, the way you jump at your own name, the way you sometimes drive a stretch of road with your light held high like a flag. It follows you the way a habit does, the weight of a lesson learned the hard way. Now, when I tell this story, I don't do it as proof of a cosmology I've invented. I only know the ledger of details I kept. Drag marks 3 to 6 feet, rotten sweet odors that hang in the low places, prints that are a half moon at the front and a trailing smear behind, a voice on the radio that will sometimes snatch your words and return them wrong. If you read this and think exhaustion or pattern-seeking, I accept that judgment. It's faithful to more than just my story. But I also tell you the nights I saw it, the evening it smiled, the way it crawled along the gravel and vanished. That is what I carry. If you drive those roads, keep the advice Dorothy and Nighthawk gave me. Don't stop for it. Don't answer voices that sound like home. And don't look for the name if the elders refuse to give it. Some things are better treated as local knowledge rather than a universal truth. Respect the people who live in those places and the words they choose to keep private. Don't try to drag a belief out of a community the way you drag a thing along dirt. You'll only make a spectacle of yourself and break the code of mutual survival that keeps people safe. Content warning. What I've said includes disturbing imagery and implied disappearances. This isn't a tale for the faint of heart. If you need to step away, do that. If you're still with me, take it as a practical word from someone who's learned the hard way what it costs to be curious on miles where the cell towers do not reach. If you want to hear more of these road stories, true-ish or otherwise, follow this channel. I'll keep telling them because the road doesn't forget, and because there are people who should have the chance to know the rules before they learn them the way I did. And one last thing before I sign off, the name I use, Fleshgait, is mine and ours, because people need language to talk about fear. The locals rarely use that word. Some won't name the thing at all. Take that as a sign of respect. Treat the land and those who live on it with the humility they've earned. Don't stop for it. Don't answer its voice. Keep your lights on and keep moving.